Okay. All right. Professor Tootle, why are you even talking about this as a historian? This is the realm of lawyers. I mean, seriously, everything in freedom of speech is law, and then court-made law, not even legislative law, federal or state or local ordinance. I know they have a role, but really judges decide what's free speech, and all judges, almost all judges, are lawyers. Introduce yourself and say why a historian is interested in the topic of freedom of speech.
Well, I think every American should be interested in freedom of speech, but and their constitutionally protected rights. But in addition to that, I have my own conception of how law should function, which is a combination of textualism, originalism, and then taking those beliefs and applying those principles to the present day. And so, in a sense, the other reason we have to keep thinking about history when we talk about the First Amendment is because, unlike other legal traditions, we do have a constitution that we have to keep referring back to. So we do have to know what the words meant at the time and what those underlying principles were in order to make sure that we keep applying those principles to the present day.
Love that. A quick aside. We all make fun of lawyers, or we all hate lawyers. I get it. No one hates historians, do they? I mean, they may think they have some kind of bias one way or the other, but they don't like hate historians. Has there ever been a protest against historians?
All the time. Well, historians are crazy. I mean, I remember all the, John Kennedy once said about Arthur Schlesinger Jr., I think he said those damn historians are always there with their pencils out, and I think he called him maybe he was talking about John Kenneth Galbraith, but I think he called them quackers or something like that, because they're always quacking about one thing or another that he wanted to ignore. And George W. Bush once said, "History will all be dead," which is another, funny statement.
Okay. So you're in good company with Shakespeare, who said, "First, let's kill all the lawyers."
Yeah. Well,
okay.
I don't know. I think there are a lot of good lawyers out there. A lot of nice.
There are.
Some of my best friends are lawyers.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start at the very beginning, and of course, the very beginning of freedom of speech is America, because there wasn't freedom of speech before America, right?
Well, the traditions of I guess we should start our discussion by remembering the traditions of positive and negative liberty that we've discussed in previous episodes, which is there are rights that we have as an individual that are your right to do something, and then your right to be left alone. So your negative liberty is you being left alone versus your positive liberty, which is our right to mess with you, or your right to positively engage in action. And so being able to engage in public speech that the government was either allowing or denying was part of a longer tradition and evolution in the idea of natural rights. What rights do you have as an individual that predate government? And so it's not that we just emerged July 4th, 1776 with a belief in these rights. The ideas about rights developed in the United States or in the colonies in the 150 years before the Revolution, and then the actions of the British government. But what they were looking back to were the rights that they thought they had, their natural rights as Englishmen. And so they were pointing at privileges that had previously been allowed and granted by the British government, but they were also looking at the philosophy of natural rights that was part of the mostly Northern European discussion in the 150 years before the Revolution. So
okay, so
yeah.
But you still generally agree with my, although I meant it in jest, generally agree that America has been pretty darn good in advancing the cause of freedom of speech.
Well, we are the first and oldest and most permanent government ever to do so. I mean,
okay.
One of the things. Yeah, go ahead.
back up then. I don't mean to insult a doctor, a PhD in history by this naive question, but the almighty Wikipedia told me earlier this morning in preparation for this meeting that the ancient Greeks created free speech, something called paresia, and maybe this is not your area of study, but to speak candidly, and that they had the opportunity to openly discuss politics and religion, and occasionally, even in the right settings, criticize their government. So going back a couple thousand years, do you have some perspective just to frame our discussion about flag burning and Citizens United and stuff that's modern in America? Yes, America is pretty darn cool. Our First Amendment in 1791. But is there some longer history back that we should at least consider?
Sure. There's a long history of government and philosophies that are making various arguments about your rights as an individual, and if, but in terms of how it is codified in our First Amendment, this combination of individual liberties that belong to you before government exists, there was nothing really like that, even in the Greek traditions, because almost, I mean, just but for this one reason, I mean, every legal tradition before the United States wasn't proclaiming these rights to be universal. So we're proclaiming the rights are universal, but we're making these laws for people who are American citizens. But we're saying that every human being on earth actually has them. So
yeah.
So the Greeks weren't arguing for, Persian rights, if that makes sense. They were arguing Greeks have rights. Yeah.
Love the context, and it gets into one of my favorite subjects, that it puts it in writing. So it's the rule of law. We don't have to guess what you think or I think or a president of the United States thinks. We can actually look to see what the law says. And yes, we have to look at court-made law too, common law, and see what the decisions are of actual cases. But the bottom line is we can read those cases. We don't have to listen to a history professor or a lawyer or a politician to determine what the law is. We can actually read it ourselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And the other thing that I said that I don't want to necessarily skip over is that it was this all-encompassing First Amendment in many ways, and that we are not a young country and we're not a young government. Everybody thinks of the United States as being a young country or a young government. We're not. We're actually much older than any other country. If you think about, name a place on earth, how old is that government? We're actually still operating under the old government, under the Constitution. And that First Amendment has been there ever since the Bill of Rights was ratified.
Yeah, awesome. So forgive me for skipping ahead. Well, no, let's not skip ahead yet. I guess we should at least do the framework and have a mention to what the heck, in the First Amendment, it defines freedom, right? It says right there in our Constitution what freedom of speech means, correct?
Well, not really, but and it's not just freedom of speech, but I mean, I don't. Do you have the text in front of you? Maybe
I do. It's
the bullet points of what it actually says.
The whole thing, the whole First Amendment, and it talks about a bunch of stuff, as you just alluded to. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. That's it. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble or to petition the government for redress of grievances. So very clearly it defines freedom of speech, right, Professor?
Yeah, so but let's take each part. Why don't you so go through just the very first part of the First Amendment. What does it say? Congress shall make, so first of all, it's Congress
make no law respecting the establishment of religion.
Okay, then that's the so-called Establishment Clause, and all that means is that the United States will not have an official national religion that is established by the federal government.
Yep.
But then the second part of it is,
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
And so that is a protection of the individual to engage in the positive action of practicing their religion, as long as it doesn't interfere with other people. And that's what Thomas Jefferson was writing about when he actually wrote the words, we should have a wall of separation between church and state. even that statement is taken out of context, because what he actually meant in that phrase, and if you read the whole letter he wrote, it was, we can't interfere with one's individual natural rights, but once you start getting together with other people, then it enters the world of politics, and of course that's going to be something that is negotiated. But you have the government can't establish a church, but you as an individual have the right to practice your faith as long as it doesn't hurt other people.
Cool. Do you want to keep going, or did you already make your point on the First Amendment?
No, let's just go through all of it, so we'll have a nice foundation.
Cool. Or abridging the freedom of speech.
And that is taken as an individual right. But then coupled with the next part of it, because the next,
or of the press,
and
or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble.
So all of these rights, what's interesting about them is how, and the Supreme Court has pretty consistently not made any distinctions in terms of freedom of speech between the press, an individual, and people gathered together. So one
and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. Right. No distinction between all that.
Right. And so what that means is, what's interesting is that, yes, the press is singled out, but as we would later see, there really is no difference between, there's nothing that says, here's your press pass, you get special rights. So you don't gain or lose rights, and you don't gain or lose free speech rights when you gather together with others or when you publish things. So it's really there to make this distinction that says that you don't lose your free speech rights. You have them as an individual, but you don't lose them when you gather together with others, when you publish them, or when you talk to the government. And the right of petition was something that was one of those older English rights that carried over.
Wow. So we just laid the framework for 250 plus years of American arguments about what freedom of speech means, correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah. So I want to skip over all of those centuries for just a second. And we don't want to talk about this. We'll probably go back to it in Q&A. But I've been completely fascinated. Then we're going to Wednesday. This is Friday. We're going to this Wednesday now. And I'd like to have your thoughts as a tickler on Facebook. Right now, there's two main battle camps, and I think they're both wrong, but I shouldn't bias you. One says it's First Amendment's right to speak on Facebook, and me as an individual, and you, and the President of the United States has a right to speak on Facebook. And the second says, this is crazy. No one should have the right to speak about crazy stuff, insurrection, or so there's both of these camps are like at bitter war over each other, that now 3 billion people out of 7+ billion people in the world are on Facebook. So we all have an opinion. We all have a tiny little megaphone that we can talk, and we all disagree on this issue. So take the foundation and get it up where we're all members of freedom of press and freedom of assembly and freedom of association and freedom of religion and politics and addressing government. Tell us about the Facebook controversy.
Well, let's get on the same page first, which is to remind ourselves that of the distinction between positive liberty and negative liberty. Your right to be left alone versus your right to engage in a behavior. So what we need to remember is that freedom of religion is protected. And that means that I can't force you to denounce Jesus Christ if that is contrary to your religious beliefs. Does that make sense? You can't compel speech. And under the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, but under the 13th Amendment, I can't force you to engage in work that you don't want to engage in. That would be slavery, right? To force you to work at work you didn't want to do would be slavery, right? So now let's think about for a moment another thing that I've already said, which is you don't lose your rights, whether you're an individual or you're gathered into a group, or whether you are assembled or whether you are publishing something or addressing the government. You have all of those rights no matter what. Okay, and it might not seem like it, but I've already answered the question. So we have all of the pieces that we need in order to answer this question. And let me put it to you this way, by way of example. If you were Ford Motor Company and you put up a website to sell Ford cars, should you be forced to advertise Chevys on your website? And I think we would all say no. Why? That would be absurd. Facebook is a private company. Google is a private company. They are not the government. Censorship is when the government stops you from engaging in free speech. But if the government was compelling you to engage in speech that was contrary to your own values, then that would be that would be compelled speech. That would be the government forcing you to speak against your own beliefs. And you don't, as I said, you don't lose your rights just because you are gathered together as a group. And it doesn't matter if
you mean as a company.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if the name of your group is Ford Motor Company or the Wall Street Journal or Facebook, or if the name of your group is the Edwards Court, Preservation Society. Like, if you are a group of people, you can decide what kind of speech you would like to engage in, and the government, according to our First Amendment, can't compel you into speech that is contrary to your own values. So
Professor, take your academic credentials, your undergraduate, your master's, your PhD, which you just crazy articulately described the history and perspective, but no one believes what you just said. And I'm telling you, everybody's going, it's my right to do it. And Facebook should be disbanded if they're willing to. Everybody just throws out stuff. Do we not know how our society is organized?
Well,
take it from your academic stuff into real world.
This is how absurd these arguments are getting now, because people are saying that Facebook has a duty to publish your opinions, which is absurd. Go back just a few years when there were only 3 commercial television networks. Would we consider it censorship if CBS News did not publish your thoughts? Would anybody have said, no, CBS News has to publish my thoughts? And they're engaging in censorship if they don't, and the government should intervene. No, that would have been a completely absurd argument even 40 or 50 years ago.
So what's happened in 50 years? Because even I have said on Facebook just 3 days ago, that is it possible that the communications system of Facebook, 3 billion out of 7 billion people, and it's prohibited in China, so you take out 1.5 billion people there, 3 billion out of 5.5 billion people are all on one common public sidewalk. I said that just 3 days ago. So John, I can't believe it, with your political science degree and your law degree, you would say something so stupid that it's become so ubiquitous, so common, so free-spirited. Of course, everybody's on Facebook and we have a right to say what we want to say. What's happened in the last 50 years?
Your biggest mistake is in calling Facebook a public sidewalk, because Facebook is not a public sidewalk. It's something that you choose to join. And when you choose to join it, you agree to follow their terms of service.
But everybody's chosen to join a professor. If I'm not in it, I don't have a voice. My freedom of speech is limited. I don't have a voice. Everybody's on Facebook.
So so what? I don't know. That is not a compelling argument. You have to get past the part where you say that this is a product that it's like saying, if somebody's handing out free samples at Costco, you don't actually have to take the free sample. Like the Facebook is not, and most tech services are for-profit corporations that you agree to sell your privacy to in exchange for using services that you think are more valuable than your privacy. And and so you've already made an agreement to, you know, curtail your own rights when you engage in a relationship with this corporation. And I think you could make a strong case for transparency and simplicity, that the user agreements should be clearer and more transparent and things like that. And Congress should absolutely play a role in requiring them as a public company of making these things clear. But it's still a private company. And just like if I, you know, hosted a blog and you were a white supremacist and you wrote to me and said, I want you to republish my white supremacist tract, I would say no, and you can't make me, because, and Facebook doesn't lose its rights to have values just because it's a corporation. Because there's no distinction, as I said, there's no distinction in the law really between, and the Supreme Court has been pretty consistent about this. And this is what the Citizens United case said.
Yes. It
It wasn't that money is speech. It's that the Supreme Court wasn't going to get into the business of deciding what is a news organization, you know, because news organizations don't have more free speech than an individual does. And like I said, you don't lose your free speech rights just because you've gathered together with other people, whether that entity is you and 5 of your friends, or if you're a publicly traded company on Wall Street. I mean, I don't know. I could give a lot more examples of this, but you know, companies put out newsletters. You know, I'm sure Pfizer has a company newsletter that they put out. They don't have to publish, you know, Moderna is better than us or something like in their newsletter, but that would be absurd, and we would all.
Or their tax structure and how they can make a profit by investing. It's up to them what they talk about.
Right, exactly. So I would just say that almost all of these questions, when they're discussed, I mean, I can tell you the reason why, which is people know the result that they want, and then they just go and find the facts to try to fit their argument. But that doesn't really change what the facts are. Like, people are starting with the assumption that I just want this thing to happen, and then they just invent reality in order to make it come true. But it doesn't change what the First Amendment says.
So I want to switch gears a little bit, Professor, because again, freedom of speech is just an awesome topic because everybody has an opinion. And often if you say, tell me your opinion, people will. And that's great and horrible. But there are 2 things that that have been in the last 40-ish years that have been really important. One, historical. The year I graduated from high school, there was a guy who was burning a flag. And we hate burning flags. I did. In fact, I'd tell everybody that if I ever saw somebody punching a flag or burning a flag, I'd go and punch them. I'd knock them out. I can't believe they burn the flag. And that was my opinion for probably 30 or the last 40 years. But then the Supreme Court said, sorry, states, 48 states, including Texas, where they decided the case, sorry, it is a freedom of speech ability to burn a flag. So just take 1 minute to talk about actions. Is that an action or is that speech? Was that a great thing that 48 states banned burning a flag? And is it a neat thing or not that the US Supreme Court said, wrong, you should be able to burn a flag because it's a freedom of speach?
Well,
take a minute, please.
I mean, I just think it's again, this kind of false dichotomy that punts on the obligations of freedom. There are a lot of things in life you're free to do that you shouldn't do. You know, just because the government, I mean, we have many obligations as a free people. The idea of living in a free country is that free, as Dick Cheney said, freedom means freedom for everyone. So you absolutely do not have the right to punch somebody who is burning a flag, but I would say that I would object to the burning of a flag, and I would never do it. But people saying that somebody has the right to do it is not approving of the action. And that is true of so many freedoms that we have. You're free to do a lot of horrible things. um, you should choose not to do. I mean, I'm trying to think of something that there's no law preventing it, like self-harm. Yeah, I could take a razor blade out and start cutting up my arm, right? But you shouldn't do that. You're free to do it, but you shouldn't. So I just find that to be a false choice that we present people with, that says that we need to go running to the government every time to solve these problems that should really be solved by individuals.
Okay.
So was right. If you're asking me if their decision was right, yes, their decision was right, and the states were wrong.
Okay, so it's good. I said a minute, and we've gone a minute, and we're going to go to Q&A in just about 2 or 3 minutes, but I don't want to go there without at least talking about the other more recent controversy of freedom of speech, which is the ability of a NFL football player to kneel during the national anthem. Boy, are people still riled up to this day. In fact, I think it's probably 10 or 20 or 30% of the reason of national presidential elections. People are really pissed off about this stuff on both sides. So same thing with the burning the flag, kneeling, same issue or different?
Totally different, because I mean, here I feel like I'm making everybody mad. Because if you're a football player, you're at work, and your behavior at work, there are a lot of limitations your employer can make on your behavior at work. So it is, there are a lot of...
It's constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech, Professor. The employer can't tell you what you can do, say. They can't.
They can't tell you what to think. They can't tell you what to feel. They can't tell you what to do in your private life, but they can also fire you for any reason,
including the constitutional freedom of speech in the First Amendment. An employer can just fire you?
Well, yeah, because there's no constitutional protection on being hired either. And when you had mentioned earlier questions about cancel culture, most of cancel culture doesn't have to do with the law. Cancel culture has to do with companies trying to avoid controversy. And again, you get into questions of what should happen rather than what is legal or what the law prevents from happening. And I think most of these things, one of the things I guess I would say that allows us to talk about these issues in a more productive way is to always make the distinction between what is legal and what is cultural. So we can have different discussions about what's right and wrong, but that what is right and wrong is not always going to be what's in the law, because we still have freedom of conscience. Again, according to the First Amendment. I mean, if you think about what civil disobedience really is, civil disobedience is the times when you say, I understand that what I'm doing is illegal, and I will now peacefully face the consequences of breaking this law in order to make a larger point. Whether or not, I always thought it was sort of strange that a lot of things about the kneeling. For one thing, I always felt like the white supremacist is the one who should be kneeling, and it's the person who believes in civil rights who should be standing and saluting and cheering the flag. So I would just say there's a lot of things that are wrong about this. People who think that the flag doesn't stand for equality of all citizens and equal protection under the law, they're making a mistake.
Those last 30 seconds are very controversial, Professor. There's a whole pushback of society against what you just said. In fact, I think it's perhaps the dominant message going on right now. Agree or disagree? Do you think you're taking a minority view or a majority view?
I don't know. I just know that I know what the flag actually stands for, and I can't go, oh, what does the flag stand for today? I mean, I know what the flag stands for.
I love that. We're at 11:32. There's two things I really kind of wanted to get to, which is kind of a freedom of speech plus association. So let's just take a rapid fire for 2 minutes, and we'll get to Q&A from whoever has questions. I I want a private country club, and I only want the people that look like me to be in the country club, whatever I look like or don't look like. But it's my constitutional right to say what I want to say and be around who I want to be around. Talk to me about the founding of our Constitution, what that means. True?
No, false. That's a public accommodation. You have to have equality of accommodation. So you can't have.
It's a private country club, not a public country club, but private. I want a freedom of my assembly.
Well, it depends. I mean, if it is truly your family and your home and your domicile, then you're right. But once you begin extending into the public sphere, you begin to have laws that affect public accommodations and equal opportunity and equal access. So it's really, I mean, if you think about it this way, like the smaller the group, the more courts are willing to say you're an individual. So I'm in my house, I'm by myself. If I wanted to proclaim myself to be a racist, to prevent people of a specific ethnic background from coming in my house, then the Supreme Court would say absolutely. But once I begin involving other people, and you say like, okay, well, family, you're probably still okay. But once you get beyond extended family and people who aren't in your family, well, then you're engaging in a public accommodation.
And that's the right answer, right? Constitutionally, you believe that's how we were founded, and it took a lot of stressing about, still to this day, but that's the right answer, right? When you talk about waving the flag and what it means,
well,
that's
also, yes,
what it should mean.
Yes, and also the fact that we did have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So if that question was unclear before the Civil War, the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendment make that issue clear, that the federal government does have the right to protect equal equal protection under the law.
All worthy discussion, but including under the discussion of freedom of speech, how does the 13th, 14th, 15th fit into our freedom of speech discussion?
The federal government has a role to play in the protection of individual liberties inside the states. So it's not just Congress shall make no law.
Congress shall not.
Yeah, it
now
is.
States shall not.
Yeah, and
local government shall not.
Right, and so if states aren't doing their jobs, the federal government has the right to, with appropriate legislation, go in and protect the rights of all Americans in states and localities. Yeah.
Gotcha. One last, this is more flippant now. We'll go to, promise, questions in 1 minute. Music. Oh my gosh, there's some dreadful music. Everything was beautiful in the 80s. And then the 90s got a little weird. 60s were great, but they were kind of drugged out. The 80s was beautiful, 90s was, and then all of a sudden things went horrible. I mean, there's curse words, there's sexist stuff, there's gender horrible thing. I mean, there is some really bad music out there, and art. And I'm not talking Mapplethorpe. Yeah, I am. But there's a lot of bad art. I mean, so we should really be banning lots and restricting the freedom of speech of a lot of music and bands and art and culture. There's a lot of things, right, Professor? This is really just not acceptable in our system of government. We should be banning and restricting and penalizing and punishing all sorts of stuff, right?
No, and certainly, but let me make the unpopular argument on both sides of the issue. So first of all, the government should not be engaged in any sort of censorship of art. However, once you begin talking about federal support for the arts, once you're talking about it getting into public school curriculum and that sort of thing, then absolutely all of that stuff can be legislated. Anything that goes over public airways, for instance, anything, I mean, there's a big distinction between what you're allowed to do as an individual, with a group of people, with other, and you can enjoy and engage in obscene and offensive behavior. But once you begin making demands on, just because you make bad art, the federal government is not compelled to pay you for it. And so again, people tend to skip past. I don't know. I find that these questions all have kind of easy answers. if you just apply these basics of law and say, no, you can do it, but we don't have to pay for it.
Or you're not going to be an employee here, or you are going to lose your sponsors, or you don't get corporate endorsers.
But again, that's a question of how private companies act. I think it's entirely fair to point out to companies like Nike, you say you care so much about human rights, but just not in China right now. You're willing to be upset about a genocide that happened. You're willing to be upset about civil rights in the history here, but not right now in a place where it's happening right now. It kind of reminds me of in a weird way, the charges of hypocrisy against Woodrow Wilson during World War I. You're willing to denounce the actions of the Germans in the future, but not right now while the war is going on. That seems absurd. Hey, Nike, you're willing to denounce civil rights in the United States in the past and in the present, but you're not willing to denounce China right now. But these are that's outside of government action.
I guess, Professor, I'll end with this, that we were hoping for some sponsors for our conversations. Thanks for blowing Nike.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. All right, Frank, you're a longtime listener, so to speak. So you get first bite at the apple. Tell us what you're thinking, or what question do you have for the professor?
The internet has changed accessibility to the public's ear. Back when the Constitution was drafted, the idea of freedom of press was something that, they had a limited access to the ear. I can go on Facebook and publish something right now, and in theory, billions of people would have instantaneous access to it. So it almost seems, I imagine, where we have this public Facebook that everyone has access to and is used for freedom of speech issues. And then you can choose to join Facebook if you want to and do whatever you want to do with that. But to have it's as if we need a government sanctioned place to publish freely.
So Frank, you like my analogy that Facebook is now a public sidewalk, and the president of the United States is banned from using something that we all use? What? You like my analogy. So, Professor, say it again. Teach Frank why he's wrong, and do it brutally so he feels better about himself.
Thanks.
Instead of thinking about it like a public sidewalk, think of it as walking into the Gap, or a store. You're out in public, but you're walking into a commercial enterprise.
I don't disagree with you, Professor Tootle, at all. I agree with that. But it has become so ubiquitous that there doesn't seem to be a publicly available space that has the equal breadth of access to the global public ear. And
so the Hyde Park example, you could stand on a little box, and if anyone gathers around and listen, but this isn't in Hyde Park, this is in the middle of the Sahara Desert somewhere. And if you're not on Facebook or Twitter or a couple other things, you just can't be heard.
But I would just say that, again, you use one of these words that I'm always careful when I hear it, which is access. I could go to my local internet service provider, if there is still one, and say, I want to make a web page called Creed Thoughts, if you remember from The Office, Creed Thoughts. And everyone in the world would have equal access to that, but they just wouldn't see it because they wouldn't be looking for it. Everybody has the right to, scrawl their rantings on a piece of paper. That doesn't mean that I have to read it. And it doesn't mean that anybody else has to make copies of it and hand it out to everyone. I don't see what the analogy is.
So the professor's making the conservative argument, and you, as an example of liberals and government involvement in people's lives, you're a great ambassador for that, Frank. You're making the liberal argument.
I
right?
am.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm making the argument that that Facebook and its ilk have become so ubiquitous that there is not a counterpoint to it. In other words, there's not a way to have equivalent access. Professor Tootle, you say everybody, I mean, if I publish something, people have a right to listen to me, but if it's not published on Facebook, nobody's going to see it or listen to it. It's just not accessible.
So Frank wants to change the Constitution, Professor.
I didn't.
Is that a good idea?
Huh? What?
To limit
No.
free speech. You want to limit free speech and association?
No, did I say what?
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to think of what the analogy would be like. I just disagree with the analogy. I mean, I guess if somebody was, limiting your ability to buy paper, to print out flyers. I mean, in a way, I guess this is what the Citizens United case was kind of about, which is—
Go ahead and go through that a little bit more. That's as meaty of an issue for our constitutional republic's form of democracy as any. Citizens United. Take us through that, Professor.
So the idea behind Citizens United was that that it isn't that money is not. It's not that money is speech. That's how it's often put. It's that almost every practice of free speech involves the spending of money. Because if you want to publish on Facebook, for instance, you have to buy a computer and have electricity and have internet access, and that costs money. Or if you wanted to print up flyers, you would have to spend money in order to print up flyers. So the money that you spend when practicing your free speech rights is also protected if it's your money. So you have the right to spend money to spread your ideas, and you don't lose that right just when you gather together with other people. Does that make sense?
So would it be, if I were able to convince enough legislators to create have the Postal Service provide a Facebook equivalent? It's a public access forum, and it is because it's run by the government or the quasi-government entity, and the laws of the constitutional rights that we're allowed are enforced in that forum.
I would say that you are running the risk of actually breaking the First Amendment, because such an entity would almost inevitably then be engaged in limiting speech. So again, let's remember what negative liberty is. Negative liberty is your right to be left alone. Positive liberty is when the government actually has to do something for you. You have the right to be left alone to speak, but nobody has the right, but you don't have the right to force anyone to publish you. Let me say that again. You have the right to be left alone to engage in free speech, but you do not have the right to force someone else to publish your thoughts. As long as you're being left alone, your rights are being protected. But once you start messing with other people, you're taking away their rights. Facebook does not, you don't have the right to tell them what to do. And it doesn't matter how big they are. You don't lose that right just because you're big. Because to say that
because a lot of us want to freely associate and give our freedom of speech on it, and then because it's so successful at that, those freedoms, that we want to limit them somehow.
Yeah, and also the market will be the driver of how companies act, because to say that there's no alternative to Facebook is simply just not true. I mean, you can engage in political speech anytime you want in any other platform. We're using Zoom, where this is going out on YouTube, which is a Google product. There's all of the Parler stuff. But in addition to all that, there are millions and millions and millions of other platforms, and you could also create platforms yourself. And so again,
Professor Tootle, what if Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Amazon all say, we're not going to allow any conservative speech. None. We're not allowing it on our platforms. And it would require a conservative movement to stand up competitive networks and solutions. But in today's world, there are very limited number of places that can actually host anything like a Facebook. You can't.
So professors, that gets similar to my comment that I want to form a private association of people to talk about something, and you said I can't do that. I can't limit that speech or association from buying my stuff because I don't want those type of people or whatever. Right? This is an interesting bridge between two concepts of freedom of speech.
So I if you think it's bad now, how would you describe the year 1980? Like, if you are saying that somehow conservatives can't get their word out and publish their books widely and have their books available widely in the year 2021, the year 1981 must have been wildly upsetting to you, because you had 3 news networks that were all liberal and PBS that was liberal, and you had essentially, firing line on PBS. And I mean, I can tell you because I was a kid growing up there, you had National Review that if you were lucky, your library carried. You had George Will's column in Newsweek. You had firing line, and then every now and then, Donahue would have Milton Friedman on, and you had a complete media grip on thought, culture, and ideas in the early 1980s.
You're saying it's better now in 2021 than it is in 1984.
I'm saying
as far as conservative thought being able to, or any other kind of thought being able to get out in the public marketplace.
I'm saying it is. There was no such thing as Amazon. So you were more limited by your local bookstore. And there was certainly no such thing as Bookfinder, right? Because Bookfinder searches Amazon and all of the other websites that sell books, including every used bookstore in America. So I have no idea how you could, in the year 2021, claim that someone does not have the ability to create and publish and get their ideas out.
So this is why it's nice to have a history professor. Frank, I kind of agree with you, as you've seen my Facebook posts. I kind of with you, but the historian here says we're wrong. Professor, almost a majority of the people believe that Frank and I are right and you're wrong.
Yeah. What are you going to do? I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I can keep answering questions, but
Okay, Frank, hold your thoughts. Great questions. Thank you. Susan, you're our second most reliable caller, so you get at least the privilege of asking a question. You don't have to or make a comment, but would you like to say something? Just give it a thumbs up or not, or open your mic. No, you're good? Okay. Jeremy or Bart or Tony, any questions for the professor, or shall I keep going for the remaining few minutes?
Well, I have a question for Bart, because I have questions about that, the cake case, and if he was involved in the legislative office there when the original
Masterpiece. Yeah. Is it Masterpiece?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if he has any particular insight, I'm interested in hearing if he knew. I don't know. Was he in the legislative office when that was happening?
And give a half a line of your credentials, Bart, because people might just tune into this and not know who you are.
Sure. Yeah, I was a longtime nonpartisan staff person at the Colorado legislature. I'm an attorney, and I worked in an office called the Office of Legislative Legal Services. We drafted all the bills and represented the legislature in court when it got sued. It pretty much never sued anyone, thank goodness. But the Masterpiece cake case actually took a long time to work through the courts. But I drafted a lot of legislation when I was there that dealt with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and the Colorado Civil Rights Division that was kind of I guess was definitely involved in Masterpiece Cake case, because that's where the enforcement against the cake shop happened. Someone filed a complaint and said, these people won't make a cake for me because I'm, trying to have a gay wedding. And the case kind of went from there.
Well, the reason
go ahead.
Well, the reason why I love that case and the way it was eventually settled is because it's a good way of looking at all these public accommodation versus private rights conversations, because they said, you can buy a cake here, we're open to all people, but the one person who worked there who decorated the cake refused to decorate the cake. So I always like talking about this case because it's a good illustration. No, you cannot discriminate in your public accommodations, but what the Supreme Court found was that the Colorado law, civil rights law, was overly broad in its enforcement, in that it would have compelled someone to work or create against their own conscience. So he wasn't saying, I won't serve you a cake. He's saying, I, as an artist, will not create art that is contrary to my own conscience. And so
Professor, you like that decision then?
Yes, absolutely. I think it was properly and correctly decided. I think they drew.
And you're also a founder of the Log Cabin Republicans in California, a branch of it.
Yes, absolutely. I've been very active in gay rights for 15 years.
And you can hold both of those beliefs simultaneously without conflict.
Well, I know a lot of gay people that are opposed to slavery. Like forcing someone to do work that they do not want to do. Again, I always said, yeah, this was settled on a First Amendment basis, but you could settle this on a 13th Amendment basis. Like forcing someone to do work that they do not want to do is slavery. Like, you can't. So again, you didn't need the 13th Amendment to decide this case correctly, but freedom is supposed to protect freedom for everybody. Like, your right to be left alone. And if you're but again, there's just such an important legal distinction between being left alone and being compelled to do something. And I think that settles most of these cases. And maybe this would be, again, getting back to Frank's objection, I think, but just draw the legal distinction between you have the right to do something, you have the right to be left alone, but you do not have the right to compel someone else to do something. And I mean, if you just kind of keep that framework in mind, it settles most of the, I guess, more basic questions people have about how the Constitution and how your freedoms are supposed to work. Just think about this: positive liberty, negative liberty, private versus public, and where you lose the ability to be left alone is, this sort of gradation as you enter the public sphere. You have the right to be left alone, the more alone you are.
Only have a couple minutes left, so I need to cut this short again. Jeremy, you're the representative of the Fourth Estate. We've already had legal history. Frank is entrepreneurial or business owner. Bart, state government. Susan, city government, who abstained. Jeremy, the Fourth Estate says what?
I think Mr. Zuckerberg got himself into quite a pickle here by opening up his forum to everybody with the promise of they can make it whatever they want. And he didn't have the content standards going into it, or the editorial standards going into it at the forefront. And now he's trying to develop them on the back end, and it puts him in a rough spot. So
yeah, I feel very bad for Mark. I think he's in a tough spot. I feel bad for people like him.
But it's basically he's trying to reinvent the wheel here that newspapers and editorial page editors have been wrestling with since the dawn of time. So, this is not a new problem.
But we don't want to get into the section. Is it 230 discussion? What's your main point or question for the professor? Jeremy. I appreciate the comment, but what historical aspect of freedom of speech do you think we should talk about in the remaining minute or two?
Well, I think one thing that I'm kind of curious about with digital media, and I was in media at the beginning of, the websites and comments at the end of stories and things like that. And newspapers at the time were trying to argue, don't edit any of that stuff, because once you edit any of it, you're responsible for all of it. And then I don't know if that is still the case, if that ever got tested in a First Amendment case. And does that idea still hold water? I mean, once Facebook starts deciding what they are and aren't going to put on there, it's a slippery slope, isn't it, legally, as far as what they are responsible for?
Yeah.
2 minutes or 2 minutes or less.
Yes,
Professor.
absolutely. And I do find it strange that people who say, I want a repeal of Section 230, what they don't realize is that they're calling for government censorship. The Section 230 protects your freedom. And when you say, I want that repealed, you're calling for government censorship. And so I find it very strange that people are making this argument as if they favor free speech. And because they favor free speech, they want to repeal the thing that protects free speech. So I just find that strange. But I'd say in terms of the media and newspapers in particular, one of the things that people need to do is they need to pay for news. And they need to pay editors, and they need to pay people to edit content. And if you are relying on free news services to receive all of your content, you should realize that all of them are structured around encouraging your own prejudices. And one of the ways that I would demonstrate this to my classes is I would say, okay, I want you to search out information on a subject, that whatever you care about the most. Take the political issue that you're most passionate about and do a Google search asking Google a question about it. And I was, okay, now, and we could do that on our phones. And then I'd say, okay, now open up DuckDuckGo and ask the same question. And because DuckDuckGo doesn't track you, and what you would find is you would get different answers. And so if you're using any of the free services in order to get your information that don't explicitly say we don't track your data, you are always going to get the answer they think you want. You're always going to get the answer that encourages your own prejudices. So because their goal is not to upset you, their goal is to confirm your belief system. And so what many people are in right now is a nonstop feedback loop of their own prejudices. And because the goal is to keep you looking at these websites and keep those dopamine hits coming. So I would just say, as a free person, stop it.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, we're over time. Well, we're right on time. Hold on. Was that you have to say something, Frank, or just a thumbs up? Okay. I can't end this though without a brief discussion. This is freedom of speech. And so I want to talk about the positive. Tony, this is your chance to jump in. I want to talk about the positive of crazy music, things that upset us and rock us and inspire us and make us think about things. So either one of you, Tony or Professor, you produce the show, Tony, thank you. Ask a question or a comment for the professor about music and how that applies to freedom of speech. Or a shout out a group or a band or something you're interested in, or it's your call to end on a positive note about freedom of speech. Let's go rock out. Do we still rock out? Anyway, Tony, what's your question or comment?
Groove, yeah. So I'm interested to know, like, I was raised in the time of censorship and things like that, labels and things like that being put on music. I just would love to hear what do you think about that? And then what's some good things that have come out of that, or how has the music industry emerged from that? era, if you will. So.
Well, I think it's in many ways the media environment of there's so much music content being produced every single day and made available on streaming services that no single human being could even process it. So computers have to process the amount of music that's coming out now. And you need algorithms in order to even begin to, I mean, a single human being could not listen to all of the music that is released today on Spotify in an entire lifetime. So, so in that sense, the media environment has made this more open than ever. But as far as what is the good that has come of free speech, I'd say every good thing about what makes the United States powerful is our ability to unleash the creative energies of every part of our society. If you think about what we gain from having creative people be at peace and in some cases even encouraged to be creative, what we gain from that is the combining of ideas in new and interesting ways that no other society has ever been able to do. So it isn't just that, people can criticize like, oh, Steve Jobs didn't build anything. But what he was doing was he was combining arts. My own political journey was just as much punk rock as it was politics. And I understand that the Clash were, officially a leftist band or something, but they didn't know what they were inspiring in me. And the same goes for Fugazi. When they said, "You are not what you own," to me, that was a cry for individual autonomy and reminding me that I need to guard my own autonomy and make up my own mind on things. And it was much more restrictive when we were coming up, but because we cared about combining new ideas, we sought out the outlets, the college radio, local record stores, older brothers, friends. I didn't have an older brother, but it seemed like a lot of other people had older, you always have that cousin who, your best friend has a cousin who lives in LA and she can tell you about Oingo Boingo or something. It's
a dead man's party.
Yeah. Or Echo and the Bunnymen. But what we gain is that we're the most powerful country on earth because of it. Some people in other countries certainly see this as a weakness on our behalf, but presidents understood this. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower understood this. What makes us powerful is our freedoms. And that's why they all have to be protected and nourished, and artists have to be free to create and not just and encouraged to have dangerous political ideas. I think one of the largest contributors to social criticism is comedians. I think Dave Chappelle might be one of the most important social thinkers of the last 30 years. But it's precisely because he dances on that edge and he makes mistakes and he does it in a funny way. So it's just a joke, but it really makes you think. And then he has to take it back later. But he's constantly struggling with his own ideas in public and doing so in a way that engages people. I think that you have to absolutely always protect the right of that artist to do that thing.
Awesome. So we're going to end the show with that. Don't stop the recording yet, Tony. We're going to end the show with that. Just a preview. Professor, I'm not planning on taking a vacation in the next couple of weeks or planning on getting sick. How about you? Are we still on next Friday at 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock Pacific for the next 3 or 4 weeks, probably?
Yep.
Cool. So we've got a ton of discussion items coming up, including we'll probably have our first official guest within a couple episodes or not. The professor has an expert on military affairs, so the history of the military would be an interesting topic, and we're not sure whether the professor will interview him or I will, but he's a friend of yours, Professor, so we'll play on that. It did occur to me that we should also interview Arthur Brooks together and talk about modern conservative movement, and is there something going on? And both, since you and I both know Professor Well, yeah, he's actually a professor now. Brooks, it would be nice. We're going to stop it now, but if you can hang out for a minute or two, we're going to pull you real quick to see if there's something on top of your mind. So thanks for joining Professor Tootle, history professor, talking about America and freedom and the Constitution and everything that makes us citizens, cultural values, et cetera, et cetera. Professor, you're doing a great job. Tony, thanks for producing those shows. Thanks for joining us, friends. We're going to stop the recordings, but then talk for a minute more if you're so inclined.